That's not that noticeable, right? All right, I'll tell you. I've wanted one of these since I was like 8 years old. I honestly don't know what feels better. Finally having one, or knowing I made it myself. I'm Dave, and this is Diabolical Props. Alright, so before we dive into it, I just want to give a little bit of backstory first. So you can probably already tell from the thumbnail or whatever title I ended up giving this video, but I made the Executioner's Blade from Naruto. Yeah. Now, this is a weapon that I have personally been obsessed with since I first saw it wielded by Zabuza when the show first came out when I was a kid. At that time, it was pretty much the biggest weapon I had ever seen somebody wield on a show, and that pretty much just locked me in as an anime fan. And for a giant, absurdly huge anime sword, I've gotta tell you, really wasn't that hard to make. But before we get into the build, I want to remind everybody that I stream every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central over on Twitch. Link in the description below. Come check it out. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's go over how I built this thing. So the first step for most of my builds is to start with a pattern, which actually proved to be kind of difficult for this project. The sword's dimensions and appearance aren't very consistent throughout the show, so I knew if I needed a pattern, I was going to have to get a little creative. Since finding good shots of the sword from the show was proving so difficult, I actually relied heavily on fan art for this one, which boiled down mostly to me Googling and just trying to locate the least inaccurate pieces. Once I found some I liked, I imported them into LibreCAD and traced them. This gave me a pattern which I then scaled up to 6 feet and took to my local makerspace where they printed it out on some large form paper. Now, for this build, I use primarily EVA foam. You can pick this stuff up just about anywhere, but I picked up all the EVA foam that I used for this build at my local Michaels. Before we go much further into this, I just want to let you all know that I've made a list of all the materials I used and where to find them, and I put it down in the description below. You're welcome. So, to start things off, I took my sheet of 10mm foam and my sheet of 12mm foam, laid them out, and trimmed them to be slightly longer than the length of the blade. From there, I marked my center lines and traced my template out on each sheet. I then used a radial razor cutter to cut out the sections I had traced for the circular cutout at the top, as well as the crescent cutout I traced at the bottom. Next, I used these cutout features in my center lines to carefully match up and laminate together my two sheets of foam. To do this, I simply applied contact cement to both sides in stages, making sure to allow each side to dry fully before carefully pressing them together. I repeated this step until both sheets were fully laminated together. I also used this time to check for any areas that might have come unlaminated. I did this by flexing the foam to ensure a good connection. While the contact cement was curing, I used an X-Acto knife to remove the cutting edge from the blade section of my template. After about an hour, the glue was dry, and I traced the new version of my template out on the foam. I then carefully used a bandsaw to cut the edge section off the body of my blade. Now, I knew a sword this size was going to need some sort of internal support structure, so I measured and cut a piece of 1/2-inch PVC pipe to run from the base of the blade to just below the circular cutout. Once I had the PVC pipe measured and cut to length, I glued on a 1/2-inch to 3/4-inch PVC pipe reducer, and then carefully traced the entire support structure onto the foam using the center line. I then used the bandsaw to carefully cut out the section I just traced. Next, I test fit the support structure to make sure everything lined up, and carefully used contact cement to glue it into place. To cover the slot and provide a little extra support, I glued poster board down to both sides of the slot. To finish out the body of the blade, I used contact cement to glue the body down to a sheet of 4mm foam. I then used a razor knife to cut off the excess 4mm foam and reopen the circular cutouts. I then repeated both those steps for the other side. With both sides now covered and trimmed, this brought our overall thickness to around 30mm. It was now time to move on to the cutting edge. I started cleaning up the perimeter of the blade's body with a Dremel and a 400 grit sanding drum. This will ensure that the cutting edge gets attached smoothly and evenly. And for my cutting edge, I actually used 30mm triangular EVA foam dowels that I picked up from Michaels. In fact, I actually used these to determine what the thickness of the body of the blade should be, since these were the largest EVA foam triangular dowels that Michaels had. Using contact cement, I carefully began attaching these triangular dowels to the edge of the blade. Since one dowel wasn't enough to cover the entire edge, I carefully joined two dowels together using contact cement and continued covering the edge from there. When the entire edge had been covered, I trimmed off any excess dowel and used the Dremel to clean up all my seams and joints. Now that the edge was done, it was time to move on to the handle. Using the handle section of my template as a reference, I cut a piece of 3/4-inch PVC pipe to length, which ended up being about 26 inches since some of it was going to be hidden by the guard. Next, I used some reference photos of the sword to determine how far apart the metal spacer sections of the handle should be. By my calculations, each spacer should be about 3 inches long and about 3 1/4 inches apart. Next, I test fit my handle piece into the PVC pipe reducer and marked a line at where it ended. This will help prevent any material from getting in the way later. Once I had my measurements, it was time to cut out the 4 spacers for the grip. Once the spacers were attached, I used the Dremel to clean up any seam lines. With the glue on the handle still needing to set up a bit, I moved back over to the body of the blade and began working on these cone sections towards the guard. For these pieces, I cut the cone sections out of my template, traced them onto some 4mm foam, and then cut 2 of them out. Once I had the cone shapes cut out, I used a Dremel to add a slight bevel to the edge of just one side of each cone. This will help the cones retain their shape and reduce minimal seam lines when they're attached. Next, I used my hands to curve each cone to the correct shape and attach them both with contact cement. With the cone sections now attached, I was ready to move on to the guard. For the material for the guard, I actually just used a large chunk of the 22mm laminated foam that I used earlier in the build. Once I had selected a piece of foam large enough, I traced the bottom of the body of the blade out on my piece of foam. Now that I had an outline of the base of the blade, I used a thick tip Sharpie to retrace the outline, giving it an extra 1/4 inch buffer. Next, I squared up the lines for my guard and cut the whole piece out on the bandsaw. Once it was all cut out, I used my Dremel to round over all the edges of the guard. With my guard now all cleaned up, I located my center point and used a drill press with a hole saw bit to cut a hole for my handle. With my guard now complete, I test fit the whole sword together before using contact cement to glue the guard into place. Once the glue for the guard had time to dry, I used super glue and contact cement to permanently lock the handle into the PVC reducer. With the sword now fully constructed, the last step of the build was to cut long 1-inch wide strips of 2mm foam to wrap the spaces of the handle. I did this wrapping using contact cement. With the sword now complete, it was time to move on to finishing and painting. To give the foam a smooth texture, I hit the entire surface of the sword with my heat gun. The key here is to heat the surface of the foam enough to give it a smooth texture without burning it. It's important to use a low heat and do this in a well-ventilated area or outside. With the foam of the sword now heat sealed, I sprayed the entire surface of the sword with 2 to 3 coats of black Plastidip. Once the Plastidip had cured, I painted the entire sword with Plaid FX's Smooth Satin Doomsday Gray. This paint makes a great primer and is a great place to start for building up a metallic finish. Once the gray had dried, I moved on to stippling the flats of the blade with Plaid FX's Dark Metallic Samurai Sword from their Armor Metallic collection. At this stage, I wasn't being too careful about where my brush landed, but I did try to keep from getting a lot on the edge of the blade. For the guard, I mixed up some black acrylic paint with the Samurai Sword Dark Metallic paint and stippled the entire guard, being careful to get as little as possible on the blade or handle. For the handle, I used some more of that Samurai Sword Dark Metallic for the grip sections, and a navy blue that I had slightly darkened with some black for the wrapped sections. After the handle had time to dry, I mixed some gray with a very small amount of the navy blue and very lightly dry brushed the wrap sections to give the feel of aged leather. Alright, just in case you're wondering, dry brushing is where you remove almost all of the paint from your brush and only then just barely drag it across the surface of what you're working on. This ensures that only the high points get the color, and even then it's pretty light. With the aging and weathering for the handle done, I was now ready to move on to the final piece, the cutting edge. To wrap up the finish for the sword, I used some of Plaid FX's light metallic chainmail to give the cutting edge its distinct silvery sharpened look. And that's about it. Now, I know I said this earlier, but I am just so stoked with how this project turned out. I have wanted one of these since I was a little kid, and this project was difficult in a number of ways, but even more than that, it was a lot of fun. And now I can finally say that I've turned my childhood dream of owning an executioner's blade into a reality. Now, just as a reminder, I stream builds a lot like this one every Tuesday over on Twitch, link in the description below. It's a great time to come ask your questions, show off any works in progress, and hang out with some cool people just like yourself. So come on over, we have a really good time. And if you liked this video and want to see me make some other cool stuff, be sure to hit the subscribe button and go follow me over on Instagram. So until we meet again, remember, if I can do it, you can do it. Make it easy, everybody. Ba 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 da ba da ba.